It is true that without the Soviet Union, there wouldn't be a communist China. But that really depends on what do you mean by communist China. Because the Soviet plan at the beginning wasn't to support the Chinese Communist Party taking power. The original idea was to let the Nationalist Party, the KMT, to unify China, and then gradually transform it into a communist system from within. That's why Chiang Kai-shek even sent his son to study in the Soviet Union. But everything changed after Chiang Kai-shek turned against the communists and carried out mass purges. At that point, Moscow panicked and shifted strategy. The new idea was to build a pro-Soviet communist government near the Chinese coast, which can be resupplied and reinforced by the Soviet Union. That plan failed almost immediately because the coastal regions were exactly the places the nationalists were the strongest. And this is where the deepest split begins. Stalin and the Soviet leadership were always deeply skeptical of Mao. Mao emerged from the countryside and wanted to mobilize the peasantry to drive the revolution. But from Moscow's perspective, that didn't look like Marxism. It looks like the traditional Chinese peasant uprising, something China had seen for centuries. So the Soviets constantly sent advisors and interfered in the CCP's internal affairs to prevent Mao from taking full control. It wasn't until the Yan'an restitution campaign in 1941 that Mao fully consolidated power and invented this notion of Marxism with Chinese characteristics. This is why during the Chinese Civil War in 1945, the Soviet Union was willing to help the CCP, but only to the extent that the CCP established a northern buffer zone and dividing China with KMT. And if the CCP hadn't acted decisively in 1948, there's a real chance that China may end up like Korea, permanently divided. This is where the Soviet logic comes to China becomes very clear. Stalin famously asked, how many divisions does the Pope have? In other words, power matters more than ideology. From the Soviet perspective, China wouldn't be respected because it was communist. It would only be respected if it was strong. And after the mainland China was unified, Stalin essentially accepted the reality. He told the Chinese delegation in 1950, "Vitus doesn't require explanations."